It's often exciting to look to the future of UNO, what it might be like in times to come. Sometimes, though, it's important to stop and take a good look at the past of the university, the people and the happenings that help make the excitement of future history possible. With this in mind, join me for Reflections in Time.
Hello and welcome to this Reflections in Time. Back in 1979, Paul Borge, who is a faculty member here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, began this program, and since that time he's recorded about 40 different people who have been associated in some way with the University of Omaha or the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And this week, Paul, we're going to turn the tables on the program a little bit and interview you as the guest for Reflections in Time, so I'm glad that you're able to join me this week.
I am too, and it's fun to be on this side of the table, so to speak, because I have some reflections too that I'd like to share, Tim, and maybe this is a good year in which to do it, the summer of '87.
Well, it is. It's July 1 of 1987, and as I mentioned in the introduction, you started this in 1979, and just to go back to that portion of the program, what gave you the idea for a series of programs like this?
Well, I guess at the time I was sort of hunting around for an academic thing for me to hang on to. I had been in management activity around here and for quite some time at the university, and I went back to class for a minute. You know, in the 70s, we were heading more as a university toward publishing, researching, things like that. Well, the thing I could do was what I'd been involved with for a lot of my life was broadcast activity. And as I got older, I thought, my word, we've got so many interesting people who've done so much. Yeah, we got buildings and roads and things come and go and change and are remodeled, but the people I felt were so key. And when they had gone, when they'd retired, or whatever happened to them, we sort of lost them. Because there was little in the file unless they appeared in an article somewhere, you know, Tim. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, how about now we've got videotape, we've got equipment, we've got stuff here on campus finally. Why don't we do something about it? And we got some support from, I think, two sources were basic to begin with, or three. Our department, headed at that time by Hugh Cowden, but more recently by Bob Carlson, Dr. Weber, who was the chancellor at the time we got started, really, or about to start, and then Dean Newton, the dean of the college I've been attached to for all the years practically I've been here at the university. And so we started very appropriately, sitting right where you and I are today. I think I can see him as I look across at you here in the studio, Dr. Bale. I think that was an appropriate place to start. He started a lot of things around here, and it went from there.
We were joking a minute ago that you didn't have to ask too many questions during that first interview, did you?
People would say that because those who knew Dr. Bale and his forceful qualities knew that he could take off and go for a long time. But as I recall, while his mind was still very alert, he was well into his 70s then and not completely well, he had a sharp day. And I treasure that day because we had an interesting hour or so together to begin the series. But the interesting thing about it, I remember more about after the program than during it. I took him over to the Student Center for lunch. And you stop to think of it, here I'm taking a guy to lunch who's in a building that's named after him. Mm-hmm. Now that's the first experience for me. And I still remember after we were done eating, he took a walk over and looked at his own painting and some of the things we have in memorabilia way for him. And it was really kind of a special day. Mm-hmm. And that's been the case with a lot of these people. Most of them I've known very well over the years, and I think it's so much fun to draw on what they have in the way of memories of this place, which is what we'll try to do today, you know.
Well, I think it's really been a great idea because it has provided an oral history of people and what they remember about the university and so forth. Let's go back in your history. You're not a native of this area.
No.
You're a native of Wisconsin?
I was born in Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. My dad was a Lutheran preacher in a small town country parish area near Madison, Deerfield, Wisconsin. And I was born there, but we left when I was a little boy, and my sister and my parents and I, and drove in our Model T enclosed car up to southeastern Minnesota, where my father had received a call to 2 country Lutheran parishes out of Rochester, Minnesota, southeastern part of the state. We're going to live on the farm now. And that's where we grew up, where I grew up, and went to country school, a one-room school during most of my early years. Never forget it. It had walls a foot thick, and as we could sit in the windowsills and play. They were so thick. Now it's become someone's home, but it was a school and had been for a long time. And that was the way things began for me.
Let's back up a little bit there. You mentioned you went to a farm. Isn't that a little bit different for the minister to move on to a farm?
Yeah, I think it was, but I think for my father, I think of him fondly in so many ways, but he was a great gardener. He was a great outdoors guy, but he was kind of sickly when I was a young boy. I still remember he'd get up on Sunday morning and go and preach when most people would stay in bed. They were so sick to their stomach, and he'd lay down in the afternoon and he'd be so white, and I'd go and to ask my mother to come and look at Dad, Papa as I called him. Well, he lived on the farm and was a pastor and did a lot of traveling, took care of 2 parishes and raised pigs and cows, a little small farm. We really had a guy living there taking care of it, but he was outdoors a lot, and his health got better. I think it was a great help to my father. He lived to a ripe old age of 80-some, and I think the farm was, you know, part of it.
Reason for that. Were your parents both natives of the United States, or?
Yes. Yes, they were. My grandpa on my mother's side came from an area of Norway that you've been to too, Tim, and we both visited near Ulvik in southern Norway. But he came over here as a young boy, became a minister, and was a pastor up in Northwood, Iowa, among other places near here. So basically we're Midwesterners going back a long way.
And of course I know well that you still have relatives over there. And
yeah.
Did you do a lot of traveling?
Well, a fair amount of traveling over the years. Been to Europe once during service, and then a couple of times since that. I guess that we've made the jaunt, and I hope to do a lot more as I get a little bit older and get a little more free time to do it. I like to travel, and so does my wife Fern. But most of our years, for whatever reason, have been right up here where you and I are in the Middle West. Not in Nebraska. Spent a lot of time in Iowa, Minnesota, but Middle West.
What about traveling as a boy? Did your father do a fair amount of traveling from church to church? Did he have different churches?
Yes, he did. The 2 churches were 5 miles apart. I never forget, now that you mention it, he received one of his first little news items in the Post Bulletin, which is the Rochester daily paper still, because once, we used to be snowed in the winter, Tim. I mean, when it snowed in southern Minnesota in those days, the plow didn't get around, you know, in the next 20 minutes. And either you had a sleigh and a couple of horses, or you stayed home pretty much. Well, he had confirmation training, religious training for young people about 13, 12 years old. And he went over a good share of the way one day on skis to get there and meet them, and that made the paper. But he did a lot of traveling to other parishes, and being a country preacher, a lot of your time was spent in the car or in the winter in what we call the cutter, or the getting around by horse even in the early 30s, in the Depression years, and in the later. A horse could go just about anywhere, even where a car couldn't make it, and he tried to hold services, you know, even when it snowed.
Did you ever think of becoming a minister?
Glad you asked that. I have feelings of guilt every so often. I was the only son in our family, and both my grandpas on both sides of the family, Borge and Norby, my family heritage, were pastors. Of course, my dad was. I have an uncle who was, but I just didn't feel like I wanted to become a pastor. But yes, over the years I did give a lot of thought to it, but I didn't do it.
What about your schooling in southern Minnesota? Where did you go to school? You mentioned the small country school, but...
The country school was the beginning. And in those days, I went to country school at a time when the school buses really weren't really going yet. So when you were done with 8th grade, you went into Rochester like I did, the county seat, and you took exams in various areas to see if you made it through 8th grade. Boy, that was a traumatic day, I remember. But I made it, and I graduated from 8th grade. Well, then where are you going to go to high school? Because, you know, it isn't a matter of going out to the curb and getting on the bus, as is the case often today. So we had in those days some Lutheran church academies. One was over near La Crosse, Wisconsin, a beautiful little area where we still have get-togethers for those who used to go there. It's a very small school, had a business school, a junior college, and a high school, really. But it was getting smaller and smaller. I mean, they were having financial problems. My sister went there, and I went there as a freshman. Left home, went away. It's kind of traumatic, too, you know. But I went there only a year.
What year would that have been?
Oh, about 1937 or so. And then, for whatever reasons, my uncle, who was a minister, too, up in Baldwin, Wisconsin, about 40 miles east of St. Paul, they, in effect, said I could come and stay with them and go to high school. You know, this business of getting to town. Often kids at home would, if they went to high school, and it was not so usual to go to high school, they'd start to work on the farm and stay there, would go in and board in town and come home on the weekends. My wife, Fern, used to spend some of her time staying over in a home, rooming, in the little town of Hayfield near there and going to high school. Well, I could live with my uncle, and I did, and my aunt, and that was sort of a second home to me, this little town where I went to high school for 3 years. And, you know, got the chance to be in sports and other things, and sort of a beginning that I wouldn't have had a chance to do probably if I'd have been spending a lot of time driving back and forth.
What were you active in sports in high school?
Well, a little guy like me, you wouldn't think it, but in a small school you could get into most everything, including trouble. And I went out for football, played quarterback some of the time, and 8-man football. That was fun. 5-man line, 3-man backfield. And basketball, I got to play a fair amount in that. Again, a small school, you get your chance. Track, slowest man in the 100-yard dash in the history of the school, probably. But I went out for it. And then, as I told you once or so, we had a great coach, a wonderful man, who I still remember fondly, who, you know, you can look up to, Ed Wall. He was a tennis player. And so he was interested, even in this little dinky town, of starting a tennis team. So I got a chance to be on a tennis team. We'd go and play bigger schools like La Crosse, Logan, and other places. Had a lot of fun. It was a great time. I enjoyed high school a lot. And I guess I learned to like school a bit when I was there.
Were you a good student?
Oh, not as good as I should have been. I enjoyed life a little too much, I think. Didn't study quite as hard as I might have, but, you know, you make do, and I made it through, but I could have applied myself, in retrospect, more than I did.
Now, throughout your career, you've been involved in radio and television. Do you ever remember back in those days of what role radio might have had in your life? Did you ever look at it and say, this is what I want to get into?
I think it started, Tim. I never forget one of the most memorable days when I was a kid. When I used to come home from country school, we didn't have television, it wasn't around. But we had an Atwater Kent radio that sat up on top of the bureau, or a bookcase, and had a lot of bumps on the top of it. Terrible sound to it, but that was radio in the early 30s, and we could listen to Bo Carter, Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, Skippy, and I mean, I was a walking radio schedule. I listened to radio from the time I came home through supper often and on into the evening till I had to go to bed. But I never forget one time when my folks got a Tatro radio. They were made in Decorah, Iowa, where I later went to college. They were a 32-volt radio that you could plug in. It wasn't just a battery radio. And they had a floor model of it, which we had on demonstration. My folks talked it over and decided they didn't think they could afford to buy it.
What would a radio like that have cost?
Probably $50 maybe.
Yeah.
I went off to grade school that day very sorrowful. I came home, and there sat the radio. I never forget it. That was the biggest electronic thing in my life, I think. We got to keep that radio. That was big. And radio was big in those days, and it was exciting, and it's where we got a lot of our news. We were starting to get instantaneous news now that we didn't get. We always got the newspaper a day late. That's the way they delivered it out in the country. So unless you had the radio, wow, you were sort of out of it on current happenings. So I got to be a good friend of radio then, and I think I started to take a real interest in it then.
Do you, what were some of the stations that you used to listen to? People used to listen to stations from all over the country, didn't they?
The station I listened to then, I remember KDK Pittsburgh, one of the old-timers, some say the oldest radio station, but the main one we listened to in the upper Midwest, and they still do often, regardless of the stations that come and go, is WCCO, 880, I believe, on your dial out of Minneapolis. Had the greatest sound, the greatest announcers ever, that I don't think I've ever heard a better ones, you know, as a kid, I was terribly impressed. I went up to visit their studios, got to see Cedric Adams, who was the highest-rated radio newscaster on 12:30 every day, Monday through Saturday, had an unbelievable rating. Well, you know, that kind of creates an aura of interest and excitement in broadcasting, and those are the things that help me along, I think.
Of course, these days, many of us will hear old broadcasts of famous things such as the Hindenburg and Pearl Harbor and so forth. Any of those things stick in your mind as listening to them, hearing them firsthand?
Yeah, I was a college student at Luther, where I went to college. And I remember they got us all together over in the gymnasium to listen to President Roosevelt announce the dastardly deed at Pearl Harbor and so on. And there we went into the war. And I could have looked around. I didn't at the time, and seen some of the guys I wouldn't see anymore because they went and died soon after that. Yeah, that was one of the biggies. And then I remember when as a boy, when the World War II really started, we happened to be driving, I think from the East Coast, my dad, Mom, my sister, and I, on a summer trip we'd had, on back across to southern Minnesota. And we had the radio on all the time, and things about Poland, and the war was going into Poland. We listened to H.V. Kaltenborn, one of the big names in the... He's the greatest ad-libber probably in the history of broadcasting. He could talk 24 hours a day, I think, and say something. But we just heard the war develop. That was a memorable broadcast. Yeah, those things stand out in memory.
A moment ago you mentioned Decorah, Iowa, and Luther College. That's where you did go to school. What took you down there from Minnesota?
Well, took me down there, Tim, I probably wouldn't have been allowed to go anywhere else. That was family heritage. That was a men's school through most of its life from the 1860s. But in the period around the time of World War II, they were hurting for students, and gradually they started to allow women to come. I remember my sister was going to start college, Ruth, in 1936. My uncle, where I used to stay and go to high school, Uncle Herman, called the morning she was leaving for St. Olaf College to try to talk her into coming down to Luther. Well, she went the other way, so that was kind of historic. But I went to Luther where Dad went. It was there. He went there to academy and to college before he went to the seminary. So that was sort of family for me to go to this particular church school.
What year was that you entered there?
I believe it was 1940. And then I stayed there for about 3 years, got my start in broadcasting, and then went off to the war. But I got a chance to work on the college radio station with a guy who was a student manager of it then, KWLC, the radio voice of Luther College, 1240 on your radio dial. And Bob Lee, marvelous guy. Remember the Martin Luther film produced and seen nationally many years ago? He was heavily instrumental in that. He's an expert in that and Bach, and works for the National Lutheran Council. Marvelous guy. He ran the radio station, and he hired me for, I think, for free at first. First broadcast I did was really bad. A lot of the rest of them have been too, but it was a community bulletin board, and I got all the little news items from all the little country papers around Decorah and would read them on the air. But that was a start in radio. That and doing other programs and announcing. And it was all live, Tim, in those days. Recording was really bad. The only recordings you did of any consequence were done on soft discs. And if you made a mistake, you ruined a disc. Then came wire recorders, which was really bad, too. It sounded like, you know, the Hindenburg going down. And then gradually into tape and other things. But that's where I got my start. Great place.
When did tape recordings come along?
Well, really, I think partly through money and the research that Bing Crosby did, tape really came into its own during and after World War II. That tape recording really got started. So we started to get some good, solid, eventually marvelous quality audio tape. But, well, Tim, you should have heard some of those recordings we'd put on the air, a wire recorder. There was a program done from the St. Olaf College radio station, WCAL, that we would record for later broadcast. Not unusual today. That's often done with most of the things we see on network now. They're reruns, in a way, from minutes ago. This was picked up off the air and put on a wire recorder. And every once in a while the recording was so bad we couldn't even put it on the air. But it was such a degeneration of quality. But it was recording, and it was a beginning.
How many hours a day was the radio station on?
Well, we sort of shared time. Eventually, it got to be a commercial station in town. Shared time with them, where we'd be on from about 7 to 9 in the morning. Then they'd be on until noon. Maybe we'd come on, and we'd have about 4, 5, 6 hours a day, maybe 6 days a week.
Now, what was your education in at Luther?
Well, I started really with thoughts of being a teacher, which I ended up being eventually, yeah. But I got to be a composite social science major, taking speech course and other things, but I didn't want to take speech pathology, so I never got a major in speech, the area where I spent most of my life. But that's what I majored in, and I got a Bachelor of Arts degree there in 1947. It took me about 7 years to get through college, counting the war.
Mm-hmm. Now, the war did interrupt your college education.
Like so many guys, I went off and I joined the enlisted reserve corps.
Were you drafted, or?
No, I enlisted in this reserve corps. That way I avoided being drafted, and I stayed out and was able to go to another pretty much a semester of college. But then I didn't go to all of it. I went home, and a whole bunch of us from Luther went down to Camp Dodge near Des Moines together and got in the enlisted reserve corps, and were shipped to various parts of the country depending on what our specialties were. I remember I took a test down there. Here's objective testing. There was one guy in our group that was taking all these IQ tests and everything, and every time we do a section, look over, and the moment we were given time to start, he was done practically. He had a system. He didn't look at any of the questions. He just answered in this pattern. He got an IQ that was in the genius class answer, which said something about the test. Well, I tried it with the sort of mechanical test in which I'd been nothing, and I ended up in the tank corps. Anyway, I went to Fort Knox and spent a bunch of time there learning how to drive and then teaching people how to drive tanks. And then over to Europe for the 21st Armored, and got our tank shot up and luckily lived through it. And
well, by the time you were shipped to Europe, did you ever think that was going to happen after joining the reserves?
I kind of wondered, I think, what's going on here, and you think of the war as being way over there. Well, finally, it gets closer and closer, and then, like for so many people, so many of my friends and your remembrances that never made it back, it was the beginning and the end. Luckily, I made it through. But it was a terrible period, and yet when you think of it in comparison to Korea and Vietnam, especially Vietnam, which was such an unpopular war, World War II was the big deal. Now, it's hard for me to say that in a way. It means something other than what it might sound like. But in those days, I mean, I agonized that I wouldn't pass the physical. I was afraid of not going. I didn't want to be deferred. I didn't want to stay home. It was the thing to do, was to be in service. People worked out at the Martin Bomber plant. They did everything. People were so patriotic in World War II. It was an interesting period in history, I think. And so I got awfully tired, and I hated the service when I got in. I was bored to death at times, and it was drudgerous, and it was miserable, and it was scary. But it was the place to be.
Did you get to see much action in Europe?
No, not a lot, because early on, when we got into action, our tank got blown up. And I ended up living through it, but riding around in an old German truck and staying alive. Funny thing, interesting war story. Our tank blew up. The track, we couldn't move. So we were taught to get out and get into any kind of cover we did, and I did. And there was a building that we moved into. And do you remember, for being in Europe, Tim, most buildings are stone, right?
Mm-hmm.
I got into the only wood building near the Danube River ever built, probably. It was about this thick walls, like an inch. And I never forget, we laid in there until things died down. Our tank driver raised his head, ended up with a Purple Heart because he got hit with shrapnel. It was kind of exciting.
Tank hit a mine, was that it?
Yeah, we hit a mine. But we were safe in there ultimately. But there was a little German kid who had a gun fully loaded, who was right around the other side of the wall listening to us. But he didn't shoot at any of us. He came in and gave up. Bless him. Or you and I wouldn't probably be sitting here. He could have picked us off like ducks. Well, the war was another matter, but it was a matter for growth and change for a lot of people. And then we came home, life was never quite the same again. Fortunately, before I went, though, I had met Fern, who I grew up with in southern Minnesota, one of my dad's parishioners, Fern Moan, and we married in 1943, and now in 1987 we've been married 42 years plus.
So you were married when you went off to Europe?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Came back, finished your education?
Yeah, I was going to go back to work for service. I wasn't going to go back to college. I had a chance to work in records over at Camp McCoy near La Crosse, where where my mother grew up. And I was going to be civil service. I was working on records of people getting out of service. Finally had a cushy job in service. But I had a chance to come down and go back to Luther. The semester was about to start. I was about to get out. I got out on the first day, January 1st, 1947. And my sister and her husband had a home in Decorah. And he was teaching there, my brother-in-law, who died a few years later of polio. We could come down and join them and live in that house maybe after a bit, and I could go back to college, and I did. And so then it began, and I ended up staying.
What about after graduation? What happened?
Well, by then we had our son, our only son, Dan. I had commitments, and I had a chance to stay on there at Luther and run the radio station, KWLC, the place where I'd worked as an announcer back before the war and after, and teach some speech courses and direct plays. So I had a job, $2,400 a year.
Big money.
You bet. It wasn't bad in those days, but we lived and we had comfortable living arrangements. Part of our time after the war, we'd lived in a barracks apartment and then on a home, sharing it with my brother-in-law and my sister. But living accommodations were cheap, so we got along pretty well. And I stayed there about 3 years. Then television really started to get going. I think, hey, I want to get into this.
Do you remember the first time you saw television?
Yeah. I got to go to a radio convention in Columbus, Ohio. Ohio State used to have a radio convention every year, big thing with programs and awards, and it was a big deal. The Radio Institute. And I went there, and I got there, and the first afternoon they were having a little party, and they had a camera sitting up there taking our picture during the party. And that's the first television I believe I'd seen. That must have been about 1948. Little did I know.
Yeah, did you think at that time, boy, this is for me, this is what I want to get into?
Well, I probably thought of it, but I was still pretty much hooked in radio and have been off and on over the years. And so it didn't really come along until I heard this chance to go to use some of my GI Bill that was left and go to the Twin City Television Lab, which was up in the old Lyceum Theater building in Minneapolis, and study television. So, packed up the family, resigned from Luther College, that was quite a thing, and went up.
It was quite a chance to take, wasn't it?
Yeah, as it turned out, it really was, because while there, went to school with a guy, or I never forget him, named Hub Brando. He was from Louisiana. And in those days, in the late 40s, before the freeze was up, there were very few television stations being built. There was a handle on things. We got to figure out how to lay things out. There weren't many jobs. So I was going to this school, as was Hub Brando. But he made arrangements for a job for us at KPRC in Houston, Texas. So my home, and our home was only 90 miles from the cities. We thought we had this job in Texas. He'd made the arrangements. I quit school up in the cities. We were living in a home in St. Paul near the Lutheran Seminary, having a good arrangement, low cost. Went down home. They had a going-away party for us where they collected $17. And never forget it, got up to leave for Texas. And I mean, we had the worst snowstorm I ever remember seeing. We couldn't get out of the yard hardly. I was just fit to be tied. I remember my mother saying, "Paul, don't get so excited. The Lord has something good in this for you." She was so right. At 5:30 that afternoon, the phone rang. I could have been down by Kansas City with my wife and son in this old 40 Pontiac of ours with all our worldly goods practically. The phone rang, and it was a wire from this Kokomo in Louisiana. The job fell through. Holy Toledo. Here I am, about 24, 25 years old. I got a wife and a son. I've given up a situation I had at school. I don't have a job. They had a going-away party for me. What am I doing around here? I called the station the next day. The manager never even heard of me. Well, I learned something from that experience. We went back to the cities. We went back to school. We went back into our situation. And then the chance came to come down here to work at KMTV, and we did, as a producer-director in the early days of television there, in the early 50s.
How long was the schooling up in the Twin Cities that you went to?
It would have been about a year almost. It was very expensive, but a GI Bill helped pay the tab. We learned to use cameras, do the jobs. It was a very practical, hands-on kind of course. That school was completely dependent practically on money from the government through GI Bill because the tab was expensive and the enrollment wasn't that big, but it was a pretty good school. We had a former director from NBC in the early days who'd been in on the first broadcast Never forget him. And he was a part of our faculty, so it was an interesting place to be.
What happened? How did you get to Omaha? What brought about KMTV?
The Korean War helped it in an odd way. A young man who was with me in the school up there, he graduated before I did. We were friends. Had a lovely wife, nice people. He had a job down here at KMTV. He came down here and he was in the Naval Reserve, and he got here and he was here a month. They liked him real well, I think. But they called him to active duty, and he thought of me. So he picked up the phone, or he talked to Glenn Harris, who was the program manager at KMTV, and he called me. I got on the train in those days, came down here, had an interview, and got offered a job for $65 a week.
Well, that was 1951.
Yeah.
What was KMTV like at that time?
It was in that old mortuary downtown, right across from Kuntz Lutheran Church.
27th and Farnham.
Black and white cameras, doing everything live practically with a multiscope and a film chain, running a lot of wrestling and old movies.
What is a multiscope? I haven't heard of that.
You could take still pictures. We used it out here for a while in our first days out here at the university. You could take anything still. You could take artwork or a positive print and lay it in there and project it. And so you could use, in other words, print pictures. In fact, some of the early newscasts down there, they didn't have any. They had one 35mm camera, and they never get the film developed in time to use it. We used slides back of Floyd Calber and stuff saying war, and a picture of Walter Spellman and stuff like that, and things like this, and a lot of still pictures. So the multiscope came in pretty handy, like another camera, of which you only usually had 2 in studio anyway. Very little film. So it was a good unit in the old days. Not very good quality, but it gave some pictures anyway.
So in 1951, you joined Channel 3 as a director. What were your duties?
Well, I started right off. Fortunately, I got in on the ground floor. I didn't have to be a floor manager and work up to being a director. I got to be a director almost right away after about one day of being floor. And I did things like the news with Floyd Calber, who went on to the network, Jack Riley, who used to be my floor manager. He's now the senior producer for Good Morning America. A lot of interesting people down there. But we were doing live shows. Weather, news, sports were the biggies. Terrible cooking show or two. Don't want to mention the people involved. Betty Tolson's still alive here in the city. She did a good one. But it had a lot of stuff like that. A lot of little bits. We had an audience participation show. Paramount Radio gave away tickets. People would come in and get funny little prizes and do games. But it was live, live, live. Ranch House Jamboree, I remember we did, which was country western music. 2 years, every Saturday night we did Ranch House Jamboree. We worked odd hours, but interesting ones. And then we did things like, it was exciting for the network. First year I was there, I got to do something for CBS. We did the Midnight Mass for Boys Town. And my folks went over and sat at a neighbor's house at 2 in the morning to see the credits and stuff like that. So there was a lot of fun in those days. But it was simple stuff, very definite. But still the basic shots and the sequences and the things we do aren't much different today, except for fancy additional things we can do,
Wasn't this also about the time that the flood struck Omaha, and that brought a lot of national and TV attention?
I can still see Ed Murrow coming into KMTV with the dirtiest raincoat with mud and stuff. They were here. He and Doug Edwards and all these big names were here covering it in the 50s. That was the flood that gave Floyd Calber the chance, really, to move on up into network circles, I think. It was a fantastic story. The university was involved. People down there night and day laying sandbags and working. It was dramatic, and we won, kind of. But it was a very newsy thing, and lots of people came here to cover it. I remember being out at the Florence pumping station out in North Omaha with Doug Edwards and Don Hewitt, who produces 60 Minutes now. He was the senior producer then. And doing live feeds from up there onto the network news. Well, wow, that was fun, but it was live. You didn't tape it and send it in and edit it. It was now. And that was a fun period.
Was that done with the real old remote truck that later came out to the university?
There's never been a Dodge truck in the history of mankind that was 25 years old and had only 6,000 miles on it.
That was it?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, it was a remote truck then and became a gift to the university later, yeah.
Well, growing up, I can remember that truck in downtown Omaha, and it would shoot people walking along the street. I don't know what the name of the show was.
It was just that, people. They'd play music and they just take shots of people. When downtown in Omaha was the hub for everything, the Brandeis store, everything, people were downtown. And it was just showing people. And you could say, hey, I saw so-and-so on the tube, you know. But it was just a half hour or so of music and people. Not a bad show, really.
Did you ever have anything that sticks in your mind, really funny on those live shows that you did?
Oh, my. Never forget, there was, I don't know if they still sell a product called Bosco.
I don't think so.
No. It's a chocolate thing, like Ovaltine or something.
Mm-hmm.
You mix it with milk, and then you drink it. It's a kid drink kind of thing. You have it on kids' shows. We did live commercials. Program manager Lou Jeffrey, he used to get migraine headaches. So Lynn Tilley, who was a musician at night and an announcer in the daytime often, talented fellow, sat in as the host on this kids' show where he did live commercials, and one of them was for Bosco. The thing was, though, he hated milk. I mean, it made him ill almost. And so he mixed the Bosco up, took a swig of it. He started to cough like he was going to die. And he said, it's something like, it's really good. Well, you can imagine the murder that did to the commercial. That and the guy that was so thin that it was only one side to him, Dick Hill, marvelous announcer, went back up to WNAX and radio. He wasn't meant for Wonder Bread, Bill's Body's 7 Ways commercials, which he used to do live. Yeah, that was another funny one. And then there was a summer relief engineer who was very fastidious, and one night we were doing live commercials like most of them were, and we had this live shot, wide shot, and here this guy goes pushing a boom microphone all the way across studio on camera. Those things happened all the time practically.
That was great to watch, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's funny afterwards, but at the time it's disaster.
Yeah.
Like moving a camera, because you didn't have many, from one studio to another one night. A guy literally got hooked on something and pulled the cable completely out of the camera. So then we're down to one camera and things like that. Yeah, but live, I mean, if there's a body there, do it. You know, you got to get it done now. It was a fun period.
That's when you see how good of a director you are.
Yeah,
huh?
yeah.
Now, you stayed down there, what, about 4 years?
5.
5
just
years?
Just about 5.
Mm-hmm.
And then they started TV Classroom, which is still going, the oldest running educational series in the country, probably. And I got to know some of the people out here a little better.
And that was with Omaha University?
Yeah, right, with Omaha University. And Don Emery, who was the Assistant Dean of Adult Education, marvelous man, now gone, he started that TV Classroom series under the leadership of Dean Hosman in those days. And a lot of contact, and we got to know each other. And I don't know how I first got the hint, but somehow or other I ended up out here as a possibility to work out here. Remember being in President Bale's office. And I was getting a little tired of television production and deadlines and things like that in those days. He said to me in a very loud voice, as he said to most everyone, when you get up in the morning and hate to go to the office, it's time to change jobs. Never forget his saying that. And I did. And I came out here, and here we stayed.
Any regrets?
Oh, you know, like in your work and mine, everybody's work, there are days when you wonder, what am I doing here? But in general, it's been a great place to grow and to work and to get older. I guess, in good measure, because of what we're doing now. The people and the reflections about them and their memories and all those things tying together, along with the changes in our campus. Yeah, it's been fun to be a part of it.
Now, when you came out here to Omaha University in '55, were you a teacher, or did we have a radio and television department? What was here?
We had a speech department, headed, at the time I came, he came same year, by Al Paul, now retired, marvelous guy, did a lot for the speech department. And I was attached to that. But we started really sort of the radio TV department, which wasn't much of anything in that day. We had a little wired wireless fed down to the campus cafeteria in what is now the Arts and Science Hall. And we had an office that I had, a little studio next to it, and a control area, and another classroom. That was our broadcast area. And in there we had $15 made out of plywood cameras that a guy who was down at Channel 7 made to scale. And people would put their heads in those, move them around. We'd have a switcher, and they'd call shots, and we'd have television make-believe, you might say, and radio classes. But we had very little equipment, Tim, yeah.
And that was all over in what is now Arts and Sciences Hall?
Right, right.
And when did things get started here in the engineering building?
Well, that's kind of interesting. I was still part-time, I think, doing a little work at KMTV and doing a class or two or helping out in some way out here. And a guy named Paul Peterson, who was the head of journalism, came by and said, hey, we're going to build an applied arts building over in the west part of the campus. We want to put a studio area in there. Think of putting it up here on the second floor. On the second floor in a regular classroom area. Lousy. I may have given him a little general advice, but ultimately one day Al Paul was looking at the plans for this building that we're sitting in. And in the room we're sitting in was an open area under this large classroom up above us here where they can seat 300. And he said, why don't we put it there? In effect, and they did. And we have the place that's been used for thousands of programs and so on since, an added area for offices that was a classroom and office area, and it's been a pretty good setup over the years. Fortunately, with almost twice the headroom we would have had in a normal classroom, and probably making it possible for a lot of the things that followed in relation to the network and Channel 26 and that whole bit.
What year would that have been when this facility here was constructed?
Wow, let me think. We must have moved into it, Tim, and the tape will tell it, but I may be in error, but it must have been around 1960 or so, or 61. About 3-4 years before things really started to get rolling in terms of 26. We had some equipment, you know, we didn't have much anything. KMTV gave us the old black and white cameras, and we had the multiscope machine, and we actually used to do some live feeds of TV Classroom from here down to KMTV on Saturday mornings, live at 7 in the morning. But we did class things, and we did things for the College of Education. We're starting to get involved with the other parts of the campus, but everything pretty much was done here. There wasn't any closed circuit capability, except eventually they added some of the rooms here for psychology and did a few things in that and biology with Dr. Ingham and with the psychology, the head of the psychology department, whose name escapes me, who went off to Oklahoma State, Bill James.
At that time, did many colleges or universities have a TV facility, or?
No, not really. Channel 12 was going along quite well in Lincoln, and was a real pioneer in terms of broadcasting. But as far as departments, Tim, and doing it on campus and training people with a lot of equipment, there wasn't a lot of it around yet then, no. It really came on in a few years, but no, pretty thin.
Any students who stick in your mind as familiar names who many of us know today?
Oh, yeah. George Reagan, who's still on the staff here, was my first engineer, really, who helped put this place together in good measure. George was a student here when he first worked with me. John Slane, who's an executive with Union Pacific, he was one of our early helpers. I'd always seem like having a student. We used so many students. Joe Horvath, who works for Mutual of Omaha now as an engineer in their operation, I believe. He was one of our early engineers. We had very few people, but we had some good ones. And we got started very modestly. And we were mainly doing class stuff, but then gradually we started to move in. Here came the state network. And they said, hey, well, we're going to put a channel in Omaha. There was a lot of bickering and fighting and politicking, but ultimately we ended up with one of the channels of the state network here on campus, licensed to the ETV Commission for the state, but housed, as it is still, here.
Of course, that was Channel 26.
Right.
And what year would that have been?
Let me think. About, I was thinking of 68, but that was too late. I think it was right around 68, I think, when we finally really got to it. Mm-hmm. But it was in that mid-60s period, generally.
Now, at that time, were you a full-time administrator in charge of the TV station, or did you continue to teach? Or?
Well, yeah, you see, that's the period, Tim, when it got to be fun to sort of not be teaching. I got out of it because here comes the network and this operation, and Metropolitan Omaha Educational Broadcasting, the local corporation MOEBA, that helped fund this channel and the programs for in-school. We were making as many as 30 programs a week in this studio for use on the next week for in-school training for children. But anyway, and along with classes going on. But it was an exciting and interesting period, but, you know, they needed some leadership, and I ended up part of my tab from the university and part of it from MOEBA, being both places, but pretty much getting out of the classroom, yeah.
Mm-hmm. That was a busy time. I can remember my starting here of productions going on all the time here in the studios. And then it kind of tailed off a little bit, probably because of funding, do you think?
Yeah, that was a part of it, and eventually, of course, during the early part of it, we did most of it live. We had lousy tape equipment, and the money was so big for tape recorders. Remember, one of the last things the Board of Regents of the University of Omaha did was approve the money for 2 videotape recorders of the broadcast quality kind that we could really use. Wow, what a help that was.
Which we still have.
Yeah.
And probably still use.
Right.
You know, earlier you mentioned KMTV, and KMTV has been very close to this station for a number of years in terms of personnel and giving things. Hasn't that been true?
Oh, indeed so. They've given us, or given us at modest cost, thousands of dollars worth of equipment. And the hours, the hundreds of thousands of hours of airtime they've given us for TV Classroom. They've been a good friend, as has WW and Channel 7 over the years too, but at the top of the class in that regard, I think, for our university, I'd say Channel 3, you bet.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, a lot of the people that are in the stations and around the stations, that are in management, have come from this place.
Of course, in 1968 was the merger when
Right.
Omaha University joined the University of Nebraska system. What do you remember best about that time period?
Well, I think a lot of us entered it with real fear and trepidation, Tim. Wow, what's going to happen to us now? We've been a municipal university, but we were finding that was about the only way to go. I think basically it caused Dr. Bale to resign because the middle levy passage didn't go, you know, and he decided to quit a little bit early. But it was a hard time. And I think we all wondered what in the world really is going to become of us. And yet, on the other hand, too, it'd say, what are we going to do? We can't. I think if we hadn't merged into the university system at that time, probably we would have become either a fairly modest-sized university and or college of liberal arts, probably private, you know, or we'd have closed eventually. The dollars just weren't there. Well, the state support helped that. And look at the place now in 1987 and the growth in enrollment. The merger has done a lot of things. But it still left us with the feeling sometimes that we're sort of out there by ourselves. And it's hard to merge various campuses together. And it's a process, as you well know, Tim, that in 1987 is still going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the early 1970s, a big addition came to the operation here, and that was KVNO.
Yeah.
How did the station come about?
A number of people were interested in our getting a radio station. Let's get out of this just broadcasting on campus thing and get out. We're serving the community. We're an urban university. There's so many reasons for having it, you know. And it came to be. It came to be through the support of Jack Brillhart, Jack Newton, the chancellors and the presidents at that time. Very modest amount of money, really, and some government grants. And a long bunch of litigation in terms of the FCC and problems with the place to have it on the dial and everything. And we got an HEW grant, and got enough equipment, able to set things up in the Storrs property over here, the former Storrs mansion, where it still is, but may move within the reasonable future, of course. Wonderful home for it.
I think that was around 1972.
And the first broadcast. We were going to be on about 8 hours a week. You know, I think Sunday through Saturday. You know, Sunday through Friday, or 1 day, or 6 days a week anyway. And the first broadcast was to be at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. We'd pre-taped it. Roskins, who was then the president here, had taped it. We had a special program. And I was off on vacation at the exact time that went on the air. And they pushed the switch and nothing happened. I mean, nothing happened. We didn't go on the air till 4:30 or whatever. The phone line that ran through a switching station out here had been wired wrong, and a guy out there went off shift at 4 o'clock. At the exact moment we were to go on, he pushed the switch and we went off the air before we went on. But fortunately, things improved.
I well remember that day of the embarrassment of trying to go on the air, and of course we had guests up there at the station and nothing happened. And of course at that time Fritz Lee was in charge of the station, and I think was probably pretty embarrassed and upset.
Fritz Lee, glad you mentioned him. He was our first station manager really under me, and he was a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Good man. Did a great job on getting us going with nothing practically. No budget, very little. Student help almost completely, as we are still heavily using students.
The station over there has come a long way
You
since
bet.
1972.
To 24-hour operation, stereo, the whole bit. Mm-hmm. It's great. It's a great improvement.
Well, a few years after that, you moved out of television, back to teaching, and I'm not sure exactly what year that was, but what were you glad to get out of TV?
Yeah, I was at the time. I guess I was tired of going to meetings and worrying about payroll, and I really, honestly, kind of missed the classroom. I've always liked the classroom. Often I liked it fairly well as a student, but I liked it even more as a teacher. And I felt I had something to offer there, and so I asked to go back to my full attachment to the communication department, and Dr. Roskins and others agreed to that, and I did, and that's been a nice thing.
Don't regret it, do you?
Oh, I've still been able to work at things like this and do some things with you and UNO Scene and
we have
over
been
the radio
doing
station.
UNO Scene for a number of years now, and I'm not sure how long you've been on it, but it's probably about 15 years is my guess.
Good hunk of time and lots of programs and lots of interesting people.
Speaking of people, you've seen a number here at the university. Who stick in your mind as maybe really the important ones or people that you don't want to forget?
Dr. Bale comes to mind first, perhaps, my first boss here. You might not always like what he said, but you knew right where he stood. He was a sound leader and a strong one. I liked him a lot in many ways. Dean Thompson, the Dean of Arts and Science, who now the Alumni House is named for, a marvelous man. The most easygoing guy you'd ever meet. He was a pleasure to be with. I wonder if he ever in his life raised his voice. Ralph Wardle, who is a giant among Shakespearean scholars, now retired living out east, he comes to mind. Jim Earle, head of the math department. Dr. Wilfred Payne, who used to be on TV Classroom in the early days, live without notes for a half hour. He could lecture for 3 years, I think, without notes. And Harold Kefauver, who was a wheelchair giant, I would say, who knew more of the finances of this university, came out of World War II, got polio, ended up in a wheelchair with a wife and a family, made a new life for himself. One of the most remarkable men I've ever had the opportunity to know. He was here for so many years. And, you know, Al Paul, I mentioned him, my first boss in the speech department. He did a lot for our place. And I think of Craig Fullerton off the campus in the Omaha Public Schools. And there's a whole host of them.
What about leaders of the university? You mentioned Dr. Bale. There were a few others.
Oh, yes. Roskins. Currently, of course, Dr. Weber. Strong people, strong leaders. I think, though, at the time of the merger and the problems that went and the things that changed, and Treywick's short tenure here in the 60s, one of the guys that had one of the toughest jobs was Kirk Naylor. I'd like to pay tribute to him. He was another gentle man who was a solid leader in a very tough time when we were merging into this university system. What a rough, tough job that was. And in essence, he paid the price of that by eventually not being the president of the university anymore, as they were called, I think, in those days. But he did a good job of tying us together and getting us started and trying to maintain some of the strengths of this campus and the identity of this campus that many of us treasured heavily, and things that he wanted to strongly emphasize. He was a strong leader and a good friend.
Early in our interview here, we talked a little bit about your wife, and that's Fern. You were married back in the early 1940s. Let's talk a little bit about her, and you've got a son, Dan. Yeah. What are they both doing now?
Well, Fern, who's been a nurse, not only to me as a wife, but I'm a good mother. She's been nursing around the city at various places. Recently, she's retired from that, and hopefully I can retire and we'll do some traveling now. She's been a wonderful wife and mother and a helpmate to me through all these many years. Some problems, but a lot of strength and a lot of help. And my son, I'm proud of him. At the time we taped this in 1987, he's a senior vice president now of Bankers Trust in New York City, coming out of a background of aerospace engineering, and he's doing real well. And then there's my granddaughter, who is the big name in my life often now, Caroline, and her mother, Lucy. They all live in New York City, a long way from here, way far from the Middle West, but now with the telephone and travel, we're not so far apart sometimes.
Any regrets about getting into radio, TV, teaching, as you look back over the years?
Oh, I suppose, Tim, there's one regret that as it worked out, I worked a long time in the business at Luther and at KMTV, and I trained, and I had a lot of practical experience, and then I did some teaching, and I did this, and I did that. I never really got going on doing a lot of graduate work. And I guess if I had to do over, I'd have gone for a doctorate. I never did that. But on the other side of it, I've had the pleasure of working with literally thousands of people, students and faculty. And now when some of them come back to visit and make a point of trying to see me, that helps make it all worthwhile. Because, you know, teaching, in a way, is sometimes sort of like mowing the yard. I don't always enjoy doing it, but you can see what you've done sometimes with the lives and the changes of people, or that you've helped in some small way, you know, to get them on the road that they're... I'd like to head a poll one day of all the students I had that I worked with here in this studio and other places and say, hey, what do you want to be when you graduate? And then write that down. And then ask them, in about 10 years, what are you doing? And I bet 90% of the time it would be something quite different from what they had originally planned. But that, Tim, is a part of a good university education, getting a broad look at a lot of things and a chance to learn a little bit about a lot, to sort of take pot luck and then decide, depending on a lot of factors, what you really want to do. It's been fun.
Well, here in the summer of 1987, you're not teaching this summer, but
No.
You have been and continue to be. What lies ahead in your future?
Well, as whatever the years the good Lord gives me to keep working, I want to keep at it, at least part-time. And as you know, I'm going to slow down a little bit and go to half-time and allow time to go out and travel a little bit next winter. I'm going to teach this fall and do my things with you and with other people. And then come January, I hope to start the car up and drive around and visit some schoolmates and friends and relatives and play a little golf and maybe a little squash. And then come back and do things from time to time, but keep active with the university for the foreseeable future in a variety of ways.
And I think you even plan to continue doing some reflections, don't you?
Oh, yeah. As long as I'm wanted and needed, I'd like to work on the history of our university. I think it's important to share people and to save them for future generations. Hopefully this will not only be in the library and at the Alumni House, a set of each of these tapes, but available in carefully annotated form for everybody that wants to use them.
Well, as you say so often on the programs, it's been great having you, and it's been fun and interesting to do this interview, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Tim, for helping me. I appreciate that, too.
This week we've been talking with Paul Borge. Paul has been very instrumental in broadcast operations throughout the years here, both commercially at KMTV in Omaha and here at Omaha University, and then now the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And we've been talking with him this week on Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time.